All right. So we're going to get started. And once you see the chat open, feel free to post your name, the organization that you're here from, or the company where you're joining us from today, or you can put it into the Q&A section, which we are going to use later. But we're so happy to have you here today. We are here for why data interoperability matters for EdTech startups. So in just a moment, we're going to do some welcomes and introductions, and then I'm going to do a quick overview of what Project Unicorn is and data interoperability, as well as the first 3 steps for EdTech startups resources. And then we're going to have a panel discussion, which will take us into a Q&A from all of you, from the attendees. So feel free to use that Q&A section during this entire webinar. We will answer it at that point. And then thank you and next steps. And before we get to hear from our wonderful panelists today, I'm going to tell you about Project Unicorn in just a moment. But first, I want to introduce them. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So Ariana, if you want to come off mute and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Ariana Bauer. I am a senior software architect and lead product manager at CPS High.
Awesome. And Janine?
Hi, I'm Janine Walker-Caffrey, currently a senior advisor and executive in residence for Avifon Capital. Spent most of my career in service in public schools and happily working on the business side of the house now.
Great, thank you. And Ian?
Yeah, Ian Latinsky from Imagine Learning, working on IL Classroom, which is the name of both a software product and a suite of core curriculum products, math, English, and other subjects. Glad to be here.
Awesome. And lastly, I'm Chloe Sanducci. I'm from Project Unicorn and a project manager for Project Unicorn at Innovate EDU. And I will be hosting this session today and taking the panelists through an awesome Q&A, some from you, and then some questions that we prepped as well. But before we do that, I'm going to quickly define for you what we mean about interoperability and tell you a little bit more about Project Unicorn. So for those of you who don't know what Project Unicorn is, it's an initiative of Innovate EDU, and it's a coalition of national education organizations that work collaboratively to promote and support the use of data interoperability standards in K12. And it's funded by the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we provide resources and support for school systems, states, and vendors, specifically referring to data interoperability. So data interoperability is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. And we believe that it can transform teaching and learning by giving teachers the information that they need to succeed and enable innovation in the classroom to help guide students. So when we think about interoperability, or we can think of a lack of interoperability with a real world example. So if you consider Legos, Lincoln Logs, Tinker Toys, and you can think of them representing different types of data storage systems like an LMS, an SIS, other EdTech tools in this analogy. All 3 of these tools, they work really well within their own ecosystems. Like Legos work with Legos, Tinker Toys work with Tinker Toys, but you would run into trouble if you try to mix those, if you try to mix Legos and Lincoln Logs. You could possibly make a custom built connector with something like the help of a 3D printer that would allow you to use them together, but it's complicated, expensive, inconvenient, and requires a lot of technical skill and can be prone to failure or error. So it's much the same when we think of this with data and how it's stored. While it might look the same in the user interface of an application, the manner in which it's stored in the backend can vary tremendously among systems. And it makes it really difficult to combine data from different sources and present or analyze it in a meaningful, easy, understandable way. So that's a way we can think of a lack of interoperability. And to think of a real world example of where we have interoperability in our lives, you can think of Bluetooth. So Bluetooth is a great example of how we use interoperability in our everyday lives. You can use it with your headphones, your computer, your car, and with the Bluetooth technology standard, we're able to exchange data between multiple devices without any complication. So now we have to think about this in the education sector and why and what is data interoperability in education. Well, it's much the same when you consider different types of district level data storage systems like a student information system or an SIS or an LMS or a learning management system. While data may look the same in that user interface of an application, the manner in which it's stored can vary tremendously among systems. And just as we said, those custom built connectors that you might have created, they could be undocumented, proprietary, and potentially risky to deploy. So this makes it really difficult to combine data from different sources and present or analyze it in a meaningful, easy way, especially for these districts. So why is it so important, especially in education? Well, states and districts, they're swimming in data that they can't really use. Data is stored in siloed locations, and it's really difficult to bring that data together. And it's not validated, which can often lead to inaccuracies. But with data interoperability, this can also strengthen privacy, security within the data stores. So we're going to throw into the chat, I think, okay, great. It looks like it's working now. So in the chat, where Susan is going to put a resource called The First 3 Steps for Edtech Startups, which is what the idea of this entire webinar is based off of. So in this resource that was created by Project Unicorn, you can learn why data interoperability is so important in today's competitive market and how you can make it your market advantage as an edtech vendor. And to set us up for today's conversation, we want to show you a couple examples of what interoperability can look like. So this is an example of data flowing into an operational data store. Just one example. I'm going to show you another one on the next slide. So interoperable standards-aligned data systems store commonly defined data and make it easily available to users in an agreed upon format. You can see here all these different LMS, gradebook, attendance, all this data is going into an operational data store. So pulling it into that when it was previously siloed. And this might be what a district is looking for. We have another example of what this can look like and what a district might want. So in this case, we have the tools integrated directly with a learning management system. So 2 different examples of what possibly a district might want. And lastly, for this conversation, I want to touch upon the education data standards. So there's 4 major open education data standard organizations in the US that will be spoken a bit about today within these conversations. We have CEDS, and this is the field-driven, federally supported education data standard and management initiative, whose purpose is to streamline the understanding of data across P20 and workforce institutions and sectors. We also have A4L, the Access for Learning community, which also hosts the Student Data Privacy Consortium. And it has standards that are used for things like rostering, and more are listed there on the slide. We have One Edtech, which is formerly IMS Global, and they have standards for K12 and higher education, including rostering and more that you can also see underneath the One Edtech section. And One Roster is actually a very common use for rostering in K12. And lastly, we have EdFi, which is widely adopted and it's CEDS aligned. It's an open source data standard developed by the educational community, mostly used for SIS assessments and state reporting. And you might be asking yourself, what standard should you integrate with? And the answer is, it depends. And again, you're going to hear from our panelists today, but it depends on what your product does and the type of data that's being exchanged within your product. And we just want to touch upon the fact that we're trying to help the schools and the districts. So thinking about the challenges in schools, districts that are caused by the lack of interoperability. The educator and IT staff, they're spending time manually rostering EdTech tools, manually downloading data, manipulating spreadsheets. They're unable to see data from multiple sources, assessments in one place. Students have to leave the LMS. They have to go to all these different external sites to access these tools, and it's moved in an unsecured and unprotected manner. We're going to send out this slide deck and it will have all the links in it. But if you want to think of the challenges that are being faced by schools with interoperability, we have the State of the Sector report where Project Unicorn has analyzed where the state of K-12 education is with interoperability. It's analysis of the K-12 school capabilities and infrastructure for leveraging education data. Right. And we are going to move to our panel discussion. So we have some prepped questions that I will ask the panelists, but also please pop some questions into the Q&A and we'll also monitor the chat so that you can hear from all the panelists here. So I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to start with the first question, which is, why do you think it's important for EdTech startups to consider interoperability? So I will start with Ian for that question.
Sure. It's important for EdTech startups to consider interoperability because if your product is as successful as we all want it to be, at some point you're going to deal with institutions, whether they be schools or districts or higher ed institutions that basically want to integrate with your product. They've got dozens and dozens of products that they work with, and it really comes down to the economics of their time and where they can put their energies, and also being able to use the data in its fullest, right? To be able to aggregate data from several different sources, including yours, to glean insight from it. And if you really want to be able to be a part of that institution's ecosystem, and have something that is sticky, right, inside of the walls of their building or buildings, or even virtually, you need to be able to exchange data in a way that they can make use of it, so you're not often in some corner somewhere. So that's the biggest thing that comes to my mind in terms of why you'd want to consider it. Now, of course, it does depend a lot on who your customers are, what the systems they already have in place, and also knowing when to time it for yourself. Because if you just go out and build it, this isn't the field of dreams. You're not going to suddenly get a bunch of customers because you've built this. But keeping an eye on the future in terms of where you're headed can be really useful.
Thanks, Ian. Janine or Ariana, do you want to answer that question or have anything to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I want to make sure that we don't lose focus on what we're all here to do. And our job is to make life easier for teachers and education better for kids. And when you consider that teachers over the course of a year, according to K12 Dive last August, teachers are using about 148 EdTech tools over the course of the year. Kids are using about 143. And across a medium to large size district, you're looking at 1,417 tech tools. So when you hear yourself saying things like, it's so easy to roster, you just have to put all your kids into this spreadsheet and upload it. Well, okay, but I got to do that 148 times. So we need to make life easier for teachers and other educators and better for kids.
And Janine, I just want to second you on that. That's actually the principle that our company is built on, is that teachers should be using their classroom time for classroom time, not for entering data, not for importing spreadsheets, not for just doing menial tasks, basically, that they feel like because someone thought that it wasn't that big of a deal, it only takes 5 minutes. Well, 5 minutes multiplied by 140 plus is a lot of minutes. So I think it's very good from the opening date to consider interoperability as a considerate thing for your users. It's just nice to have as a user point of view.
Great. Thank you all. And I'm going to share my screen again so that I can show the question. So this question is going to be first to Janine, but then Ian and Ariana, if you have anything to add from your experience with companies being funded or the companies you're a part of. But the question is, what do you take into consideration when deciding to fund a company?
Yeah, thanks. This is one of the first questions we always ask is, where are you on interoperability? Are you doing rostering? Can you connect to LMS? Do you connect to SIS? So all of those things are really important. And the reason we ask that is for several reasons. First of all, it shows us that you are actually in touch with customers, that you are trying to get that right product market fit. Secondly, it tells us that you are a company that is ready to scale. And thirdly, it says that you have an understanding of the challenges and complexities in working with school districts as customers, which if you haven't sold to school districts, it's a whole different ballgame than most other businesses. So we understand that if you're thinking about that and you're taking steps and actively creating interoperability, we know that your company is not a baby. It's starting to develop and it's starting to think about the market in a holistic way.
Great. And anything to add to that, Ian or Ariana, from your experience with companies being funded?
I have not worked for an institutional investor, but personally have invested in one. And it really boiled down to who was working on the business, right? Their experience, of course, the problem that they were solving, right? Validating that was a real problem to be solved and making sure they had a good cohesive team that had clarity around the problem they were solving and proven track record to be able to solve it.
All right. And I'm going to go to the next question. And thanks everyone for putting your questions into the Q&A. We have a couple questions and we're going to do that Q&A after a few of these questions, but feel free to put more into there. So the next question is, and I'm going to start with Ariana. Tell us more about your experience working on interoperability, specifically with startups.
Well, one of the primary focus of our company is integration, automation, interoperability. And one of the things that we love to do is work with new companies, not even necessarily startups. Sometimes it's just established companies who are entering interoperability for the first time because they realize it's critical in the market space. And so what we do is we look at their overall concept. We ask a lot about who their customers are, what is the goal that you're trying to achieve. And, that's kind of how we do. We help them get the right questions first, so then we can work on the right answers, because I think sometimes finding the right question is almost more difficult than finding the right answer.
Thanks. And Janine or Ian, anything to add about specifically your experience working with startups with interoperability?
I would say that a lot of times people just underestimate how critical it is. Any district of size won't even work with you unless you have at least some level of interoperability. So to think it's something like you can think about later is very short-sighted. You've got to be thinking about this from the very start and prove that you're a backable company.
I think especially if you know that your prospective customers who are most likely to close are going to be requiring this, particularly useful. I think also just the scope of integration, right? The amount of time and energy and effort it takes to do that integration is often underestimated. And it's going to displace items on your product roadmap. And you have to be very deliberate about that, right? Again, the timing and making sure that it takes the priority that's necessary in order to close those deals, to help those teachers, help those district admins. You just have to make sure that it's a first-class citizen, in your roadmap, and not something that you're hoping will just be taken care of easily, later.
And Ian, I'll stick with you for the next question because you're basically getting into this, but what are the benefits of implementing interoperability early at a startup?
Sure. So I'd say at least what you should be doing is you should at least know that at some point you're going to have to do this. And so when you think about the guts of your system, right, the architecture, that your team understands this is a part of the long game. And so when we're coming up with things like identities for users, permissions, how people sign in, how data around assessments, or use is exchanged, that even if you're not necessarily building that in from day one, you're anticipating that coming soon. Especially if your sales team is proving to be successful. And so the benefit is keeping your eye on the long game, not building something that paints you in a corner or diverges you from your inevitable future if you're successful, and also just making sure that you are setting up your sales team for success. That's what comes to my mind.
Ariana, do you have anything to add to what are the benefits of?
Yeah. Actually, similar to what Ian's saying, preparing up front sometimes feels like it takes longer, but in the reality, what you're doing is you're saving that hurdle of. We work with a lot of companies who said interoperability wasn't a big deal, or interoperability wasn't a thing when we started. And now they're coming back around, and the amount of time and energy and money you have to put in to retrofit a product programmatically is really big. It's much easier to take that time up front and to plan ahead and to plan well, even if you choose not to implement it all at once, to have that plan in place and a phasing of when you plan to implement it, having it in your roadmap. That's really critical, I think.
Great. And I'm going to stick with you, Ariana, for this question of where should you start?
Well, isn't that the $1 million question, right? Where should you start? Well, I think first it's good to start by thinking about who is your client. Are you looking at, do you sell to states? Do you sell to individual districts? Do you sell to big districts? Do you sell to small districts? Do you sell directly to teachers? Then thinking about, okay, now I know, think about which state you're in as well, because different states have different required standards. For instance, in Oklahoma, by law, you have to work on the SIF specification. They have a single specified version of SIF, and that's what you have to work on if you're a SIS vendor to send data into the state and to interop with other software. It just makes sense to go down that road. Whereas other states might have EdFi, other states, might use other mixes of standards. So knowing where your clients are is actually really critical in the K12 world, because there are these sort of laws and requirements. Some states it's laws, some states it's just what they chose to implement. They went out to RFP and that's what they chose to implement. So doing those things is like thinking about that up front and figuring out who your customer really is, I think is a really good place to start. Once you know that, if you say, okay, I'm trying to get into the Oklahoma market, or I'm trying to get into this market. One of the things I recently worked with a company who's coming from the private school market and they want to get into the public school market. They're a long established private school. They have a different way that they work. Now they want to know what to interop. One of the first things we ask them, which states do you want to work in? Do you have an idea of what kind of standards you might need? And then sort of shortlisting all of those questions down and building a good base of what you know, and then starting to say, okay, what is the best tool for this job? What works the best for my company for what we're deciding to do?
Thank you. And Ian, or Jean.
Yeah, sure. So one extra thing that I think about too is comes from a story at LearnZillion. LearnZillion was what IL Classroom was before it was acquired. And one of the things we learned was that the qualitative feedback, or even just the ideas or suggestions or needs that were expressed by our customers, didn't always align with our teacher users, right? And what they were actually using in the classroom. So we also forged a great habit of looking at our data, right? We set up things like Google Analytics or Mixpanel to look at the use of our users and see what they were actually doing. And I remember years ago seeing this thing called classroom.google.com just start to climb up the referrer chart in our reports, and basically noticed that a lot of our traffic was coming from this product we had never even heard of, and come to learn, this is Google's answer to LMSs, for K12 and higher ed, and realized that a significant number of our teachers were using this, even though we had not heard a single word about this from our customers. And so sometimes you have to look at your data, right? To look at your analytics data to see, are they coming from Canvas, Schoology? Are they coming from, some other system? And really applying the 80-20 rule and saying, where do we need to invest in interoperability to make sure that our end users, are having that streamlined experience and able to have something that's really engaging for their students.
And Janine, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would. So if you got to pick one place to start, and I definitely appreciate Ariana's comment about who your customers and all of that, but pretending that's not as big of an issue, if you're really brand new and don't have a customer base yet, I would say I would start with one Edtech and go with the one roster standards, because generally speaking, you're going to be in pretty good shape for rostering if you do that. Like the minimum amount you need to be able to do in order to sell to districts is rostering. And so I would start with that. And then I would educate myself really well. I saw there was somebody from Edlink on the webinar, so thanks for being here. Edlink is a great place to learn about this topic. ClassLink, Clever, Learn Platform, and Google Classroom. If you just talk to folks, partnership folks from all of those companies, and just start asking questions and really
actually, Janine, you forgot
this.
us on the list. We're right up there with ClassLink
I'm
and
so
Clever.
sorry.
We do the same thing. So
sorry, Ariana.
So, yeah, I just didn't want to forget to mention us on the list. We've actually been around for longer than anybody. We've been here for 25 plus years, and we only work with K12. We are a small company from the ground up, so we love working with new startups because we know the struggles. So
I didn't forget about you, but we had already talked to you. So, but thank you so much for jumping in there with that, because it's so important. You have an open door for Ariana right here to talk with you about this topic. And so you've got to educate yourself and really understand what you're trying to do and who can help you best and what all the biggest levers you can pull are.
Awesome. Thank you. And a few more questions before we turn to the actual Q&A section. So again, if you have questions, pop them into the Q&A and we'll be going through it there rather than the chat, just so that we can see exactly where the questions are. So I'm gonna start with Ariana here. So what hurdles have you, as the panel, had that you suggest for new startups to look out for when implementing interoperability? What hurdles have you seen with startups?
The biggest hurdle is this idea that the data is going to look polite and pretty when you get it, because it's not. Student information systems, and I hope nobody is in one that's going to get upset, but oftentimes they have a lot of free data entry. Districts can customize and add fields and change what fields mean. And they can do lots of really strange things with their data. So you get data and you think it's in an interoperable standard, but the content that you got in that data field is not what you were expecting. And not only is it not maybe have invalid characters, but it may not be even the data that you're thinking of. And I'm going to tell you about a really crazy use case where we went into a district and last name was not last name. And first name was not first name, because they had an issue where there was a lawsuit and everyone is labeled as Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. in the first name field. And they had moved last name because they didn't want people knowing the teacher's first names and last names to look them up on the internet. So even though in a standard, it should be in all great cases, it should be one way or the other. So knowing this ahead of time and knowing that data is going to be a conversation you have to have when you go to a new district, talking to them beforehand, getting them to understand that interoperability is not a magic wand. It doesn't mean everything's going to work just right out of the gate. You're not going to press a button and everything's just going to instantly happen. That they have to understand that sometimes their data might not support the cases that they want to do. Yes, in some districts, you can support it. They may not send you enough data for what you need in specific cases. They might send it to you weirdly. So just knowing and educating your client and letting them know that this is how interoperability is going to work, meeting expectations and managing expectations, right, is a really big part of the actual getting your hands in and getting dirty and actually doing the real world work. So garbage data is something you have to be able to handle from day one, knowing that that's going to be a standard thing. There's always going to be a chance for garbage data, and users do weird things.
And Ian, anything to add? Any hurdles that you suggest for startups to look out for with interoperability?
Nothing new's coming to mind. I think Ariana covered the space really well.
Awesome. And Janine, anything to add or agree?
The one I would add is looking for anything in your software that's going to be blocked by school districts' filtering systems. Make sure everything's whitelisted in a district so that your stuff actually works.
Perfect. Thank you. And here's our last question before we go to the Q&A from the attendees. So I'm going to start with Ian. What technologies are out there to use to implement interoperability in a startup app?
Sure. So you heard a few already. So some of these will be repeated. But obviously some of the open standards, like the one Edtech ones, our product, for example, implements one roster through a partner called ClassLink and another called Clever, as well as their proprietary APIs. There's LTI, which we do natively and also through something called single integration, which would be similar to EdLink, right? These middleware that try to do one translation with your app to many others so that you don't have to build 35 different integrations. Those are the ones that are in our K12, core curriculum space.
Well, this is the primary focus of what our company does. We do this both at the districts with applications that don't have interoperability. We kind of make them interoperable by being in the middle. And we have a number of tools that you can implement within your products, similar to ClassLink and Clever, but they are more mature and have been in the real world longer. And so we help companies, we can get companies off the ground in as little as a couple of weeks with our products. We've actually seen people roll out SIF agents and one Edtech agents in under 2 weeks with our tools. So.
Great. And anything to add, Janine, before we go to the Q&A?
No, nothing to add. Thanks.
Perfect. All right. So we have a couple questions queued up. And again, feel free to drop additional questions in there. We're going to start answering them. So any of the panelists, just jump in. And the first question is, many customers have asked us to integrate with their assessment data. Is there a good place to start? So many different assessments, benchmarks.
So I'm going to ask by that question, so assessment data can come from a number of places. Sometimes assessment data is sent directly to the state and then down to the district. So I guess there's further questions as at what level are you looking at collecting the assessment data? At a district level, is it coming directly from the assessment vendors? So sometimes it's a big answer. The big question is, what does the data picture look like in choosing the best standard? If they can deliver it to you in a common standard, then it's really not that difficult to implement. But oftentimes we see assessment data coming to us in non-common standards because the assessment companies haven't sort of collected on the same page yet a lot of times. And Ian, I don't know if that's what you're seeing too.
It is, yeah. I was going to say, interestingly enough, like we've actually had to take a step back. And basically what our product does is it can output some really, really nice CSVs that can be transmitted over SFTP to be secure and to be in a format that can be ingested by products. And it can be ingested by K12 products, even stuff like Microsoft BI or Tableau, right? Different districts use different tools to look into their data. We had to drop like basically a level lower to provide something that could be, again, 80-20 rule, like could be used by most of the systems that people were using to look at data.
Now, one of the things we're offering with our states is the ability to quickly create APIs for vendors to consume data coming from the state so that you don't have to individually consume, because in a number of states, they like to collect it and then they can send it back down because of how the state level testing is versus the district level testing. And then are you guys offering APIs for vendors who want to work with you directly over an API? Or have you guys selected a standard that would be API based yet in your software?
Referring to ILC? No.
Yeah.
No, because I think most of the most of our customers have ended up using assessments in our system itself because we're the core provider.
You guys are the provider of the data.
Provider of the data. Yep. And the content, and the teachers want the students taking assessments in the system that they want the content. So we've attacked it that way. There are definitely some larger districts who want to use third-party assessment systems like Mastery Connect or others, and so they usually have the staff and the capacity to ingest data from different sources and pull them together themselves.
Okay, the next question is says, I've seen startups that think they have differentiated properties as part of their competitive advantage, and their early investors seem to have bought into that as well. How can we make it evident to them that even if this is a differentiator, it is a bad strategy, particularly as their product or products gain traction?
Asking for the definition of a differentiated property.
I was just thinking the same thing.
Yep.
I wasn't quite sure that I understood the question, but maybe I thought I was.
I think Michael J might have hopped off. But we'll connect with him on the TAC and ask him to.
This is Susan just popping in. I was just wondering if he was talking about maybe like closed systems or proprietary ecosystems. That was how I interpreted it. I don't know if that's what he meant, but that was my thought.
I think one way I could interpret it is they're doing something different, right? And I think that matters a lot, right? This is a very, very old industry, not so much ed tech, but education. And so we need new things, right? We need things that deviate from the norm to try to change the game. However, we've got to work within existing ecosystems. And so I think in terms of convincing founders that at some point they can't count on their distinctiveness being the thing that's going to make them win. I think it's a matter of explaining that this isn't like a B2C market or even a B2B where there's a lot of flexibility by for the consumers to just adjust to a touchscreen smartphone is like a whole new category and thing. Working in education, there are laws, there are habits, and there are entire systems that things have to be plugged into. And so no matter how unique your differentiated properties are as a business or as a product, you're going to have to connect to the norm in some way, if at all, just to help people get their jobs done better, to win them as customers and win them as users, and then shift them over time to this differentiated future that that makes your product even better than others.
Okay. The next question is, do you see an appetite for interoperability writing consumer data, for example, parent contact details, into established systems like an SIS or LMS?
Well, we see an appetite for consuming the data typically that's entered in the SIS. Oftentimes what we see is parent contact information is primarily collected in the SIS and then distributed out. And there is a huge need to consume that data because parents are becoming, actually, especially post-COVID world, the parents want to interact and want to be a part of their children's education in a digital and simple to use way. We also have certain laws that require parents to be able to interact and say, I do or I don't accept what's happening in a classroom. So I think being able to talk to assist to get that data so that the districts only have to enter it once is important. On the other hand, keeping parent data up to date has been a struggle of struggles. We can't rely on cell phone numbers for multi-factor authentication. Emails are not always accurate. Which parent to contact? You'll have a whole list of people inside a SIS, and some of them could be just a bus pickup or drop off once a week at grandma's house. But is grandma the one you send an email to when you need really critical information? So being able to identify that out of the data and leveraging that data and quality of data is a big struggle.
I think even the beachhead attack into that market could be helping districts sort that out first. I think a lot of
Yeah,
companies
it really, even just between schools and after school providers, there's a huge need. You know, your kid might be in an after school program at their own school, but it's being run by a separate organization. And that organization doesn't even have the ability to contact the parents through the normal messaging apps. So, you know, there's definitely a need for thinking through some of these issues.
All right. The next question is, building integrations is quite cumbersome for a startup. It's not only time consuming, but costly. What are the best ways to integrate with multiple applications that enable interoperability as well as integration with various student information systems and tools?
I'm going to take that one. You use a common standard. Selecting not to be proprietary, but selecting to work on common standards and leveraging at least one or two common standards. You are probably not going to be able to get away with one. Probably one Edtech and SIF are a good place to start. You may have to do all three, depending on which states you're in, which would be EdFi. SEDS is not typically a collection. That's typically used a bit more at the state level. So some districts are getting into SEDS, but not as much, only the very large districts. And looking out for tools like what we do, we can get people off the ground in a couple of weeks because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So thinking about do you want to spend the money with a DIY approach, or do you want to spend the money with a product that does tie you to a product, any product? I won't deny that. I mean, you have to you're stuck with that, right? Until you change. So it's a matter of looking at your cost analysis, where you want to put, which basket do you want to put your eggs in?
Okay, and the next question is to discuss the overlap between single sign-on and data interoperability from your perspective. Which of those is really a bigger pain point? I'll continue with the question. If we simply allow login with your Google account, which pretty much sums up all K12 students have, how much does that help solve the SSO problem? Could the common Google login also be used as a hook for data interoperability as well? So a couple.
This is an excellent question, because authentication is not the same thing as actual account management creation. That is not the same thing as actually getting users made, right? As rostering, as all the other information. You have to almost think of them as two different approaches. So some vendors will cover you, for instance, like where you might use Clever, and that gives you single sign-on and your data. But without a third-party tool, you're going to have to think about authentication as possibly a separate component, especially in districts where they're leveraging Google and Office 365 and Active Directory. Active Directory should not be forgotten. It is still a very commonly used tool. And so your authentication components might have to be modular, separate from your interoperability components, if that makes sense.
Yeah, having something like a Google login, right? It lets you get the users in, but there's the second part of the equation, which is how do you get the data out? You still have to build something, right, to get that data out.
Yeah, getting the user's login information does not tell you what grade they are. It doesn't tell you which classroom they're in. It doesn't tell you who their teacher is. It doesn't tell you which course they're in. And you have to be very careful to filter your data in an appropriate manner. So that's where things like supporting more of Google Directory, supporting Active Directory, but also supporting the actual data itself. So when you are implementing the account creation, yeah, you need to make the user in your app. You need to set the user into a school. You need to set the user into classrooms. You need to set, depending on what your application does, there's a whole bunch of information, and that's not going to come across to you with a Google authentication. It's not going to cross with an Office 365 authentication. That needs more.
And the next question is, how are these common data models and standards different than all the other ed techs that have tried it? Salesforce, EDA, Ellucian, Workday, Anthology, etc. Well,
these are focused on K12, and K12 has a unique situation. it is not like any other industry you'll ever be in. I see people coming from the business world and they think it'll just port right over, and K12 is unique. They have very interesting concepts because they are thousands and thousands and thousands of users. Even in your large company, even in a huge company, you don't have as many users as you do in a school district. For instance, Orange County Public Schools in Florida is the largest implementation of Active Directory on the planet. With almost I think it's close to 300,000 students, but then you have teachers, you have staff, you have, so there's a unique perspective that the standards in K12 have to handle that is not in. The closest thing to it, in my personal opinion, is the medical industry standards. Those are more similar. We also have similar issues with privacy as to medical. I think that's closest. But the business related things like Salesforce and that, I don't think they transfer well because they're not the same. It's not the same thought behind them.
I'd also add that if your company has been dealing in other markets like Europe, for example, the kinds of issues that you're dealing with there are not necessarily as complex and pronounced as they are in the U.S. The United States school districts are much more demanding customers in terms of what you can do and should do here.
Yeah, and our education system works wildly different from theirs. We actually worked with a number of British and English. So originally when SIF was going into that market, and I was just shocked at how different it was compared to our school system. And I had already been familiar with Lebanese school system. My father, I grew up half Lebanon, going back and forth, and there is just a dramatic. The how a school works is really different.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is, can you elaborate on how companies already selling to K12 schools can make the jump to district sales?
So they're saying their school sales right now, they're going school by school and they want to go to district by district.
That's how I read it as well.
Yeah.
And yep.
I don't know because I have not sold school by school.
I'm happy to address that. So it's great when you get your foot in the door at a school, but you're smart to be thinking about broader sales to an entire district. So you have to get a champion in that individual school to introduce you to somebody in the district office who can be convinced that it should spread throughout the entire district. And it's really like anything else. It's about relationships. So you prove your worth to one person in a school and you say, hey, I'd really like to do this other elementary school down the street. Who at the district office can I talk to? Or, the other way to do it, of course, is to get into several schools within a district and then go to the district office. But you've got to get great relationships, provide fantastic customer support, and get those people to recommend you to the broader audience throughout one district. And then you do that with another district. And then you figure out, okay, now who would be our buyer at the district level? And you codify that until you can start approaching districts first.
There's a great book called Lean B2B, which is inspired by the classic Lean Startup. And it talks about how to build and navigate an organizational map. And it's one thing you really have to get comfortable with in the public school system in the US, is understanding who are the players. And those are actually different for each district, it seems, right?
Right.
Who's in what department?
Very much.
Who's got
Right.
2 or 3 roles, right? And so being able to navigate that, and of course, using the allies within the school customers that you already have, is a good way to start. Another way is, of course, to look at what are the RFPs, right, or RFIs that they're putting out that your company may be uniquely positioned to satisfy. But I would stress the relationships and being able to navigate that organizational map is probably the best place to start.
And learning which department to talk to in a district is important. Every district departmentalizes differently. Where you think you're going to be talking in one group, you might have to be talking to a different group. And a lot of times you talk to someone, they're like, yeah, I don't do that. And then like, that's the end of it. And then you have to kind of push. Well, who does?
Great. And we have two more questions. So any insights that could be applicable to workforce education?
Yes, workforce is really critical at the state level. So a lot of the states are attempting to do things like UIDs that come across all the way into the workforce model and sharing data back and forth. And one of the big hurdles in going up between K-12 and workforce is the identification of data, how to pass data safely, where you don't end up with a person in the workforce being, they don't need to see that you were suspended in 7th grade for 3 days, right? That's not fair. It's also important, for instance, in states like Wyoming, where we work, what they do is they track the success of a student all the way from K-12 up through workforce. So you do need to interop at the state level, especially within the department, so that you can share data back and forth and deciding on standards. And SEDS is a very good model to look at whenever we're talking about workforce. That is where we start to see the shining in the right tool for the job, right? You can't hammer everything. SEDS is a great place to start looking and thinking if you're looking at how you might interact with the state on workforce level.
Great. And the last question is, we have not found a system that will follow rosters departmentalized students in elementary schools. For example, if they go to reading with a different teacher and a different cohort of kids. Have you seen this before?
Are we talking about,
yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was going to ask, are we asking about, does the standard support it, or are we seeing if we've seen it in the data?
And Tony said rostering.
The question specifies it, but I would say that our experience is that often the data models are capable of supporting this, but the districts don't fully utilize it. And so it is completely different from entity to entity to see how they're mapping stuff, such that our product does not do a good job making it really easy for people to do that by slurping in all the data from their district. They have to set it up by hand.
That goes back to data. We talked about that earlier, is what data looks like may not be what you're expecting, even when it follows the standard.
Okay. So we're going to wrap up here, and I'm going to show you in just a moment some opportunities to continue this conversation and continue to connect. So before we end today, and we send you out this slide deck so that you can look at all the resources, a really great place to start today, and you can do this right now, is to sign the Project Unicorn vendor pledge. The QR code is there if you have your cell phone, or there's the website. It takes less than 2 minutes. And what you're doing is pledging your commitment to increase secure access, privacy, and interoperability in your products, and empower customers, educators, families to achieve an enhanced level of engagement in their students' education, and to improve the impact of educational data and to inform teaching and learning practices. And some benefits of this, of the pledge and signing the pledge. So you'll join a community of like-minded edtech vendors and school systems. So the people that you see on this call today, they engage with Project Unicorn, by signing the pledge. And some members are on our technical assistance committee or technical advisory committee. You'll have access to the Project Unicorn online community. You'll have one-to-one technical assistance calls and referrals. So when you sign this pledge, you will get a email automatically having some time to schedule with Project Unicorn, which is me and my colleague Susan, who is also on this call. And we can help you further with any of the questions that you asked today. And then there's also opportunities for scholarships, for conferences, professional learning to improve human capacity for interoperability. And you'll learn about these events, other webinars, or other resources that we are sending out. So we really encourage you to sign the pledge. You can do it right now. Again, it takes about 2 minutes of your time. And we also have our resource library on the Project Unicorn site. So we have just like the first 3 steps for EdTech vendors, we have a bunch of resources there for you to start with and think about. And we have all of our webinars, just like this one, that will be up on our YouTube channel if you would like to check that out. And we are going to be having another webinar in the new year. It is on January 12th, Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And this one is going to continue down the theme of vendors, so EdTech vendors, and talking about our interoperability certification, which can be your market advantage. So we really hope that you'll join us for that. And Susan will put the link to that webinar into the chat. And we want to thank you. We want to thank Ian and Janine and Ariana for your insights today. This was a really wonderful chat, and we want to thank all of you for your time today and for joining. And we will follow up with this slide deck as well as some additional resources. And if any of the panel speakers want to continue to connect with the attendees, feel free to pop your email into the chat for them to continue to connect. Otherwise, thank you, everyone, and thank you to the panelists today for joining us.